Towards the beginning of this week's parasha of Re'eh, Moshe Rabbeinu instructs the Jewish people that when they enter into the land of Israel, they must destroy all of the sites of avodah zarah, of idolatry. And he adds the words, Lo ta'asun kain laHashem Elokechem. Don't do the same thing to Hashem, your God. The Gemara in Shabbos on Daf Kuf Chaf Amud Bet interprets this pasuk as a prohibition against erasing the Shem Hashem, God's name. Moshe here warns Bnei Israel not to treat sacred articles the way they were to treat the Avodah Zarah. And this includes erasing HaKadosh Baruch Hu's name. In this context, the Gemara further notes that since the Torah formulates this prohibition with the term lo ta'asun, don't do, we can infer that the prohibition is limited to direct, active erasure, actually asiya, to do something, as opposed to indirect erasure, grama. On this basis, the Gemara supports the view of Rabbi Yossi, who allowed someone who for some reason had Hashem's name written on his skin to go into the mikveh. Even though the name might be erased as a result of the contact with water, it's not definitely going to happen. It only might happen, and therefore he considers it to be grama. However, if a person were to go ahead, explains the Rashba, and put some water around the material that had caught fire, knowing full well that the fire, when it reaches the dampened material, will be extinguished, in that case, he doesn't feel it's grama anymore, and therefore it's prohibited. Rav Asher Weiss, in his Minchat Asher on the Parsha, quotes Reb Dov Beresh Weidenfeld, the Chabina Rav, in his Dovev Mesharim, as drawing upon the Rashba's comments about getting the edges of a cloth wet to discuss the question of whether or not a patient who had an infectious disease was allowed to bring their tefillin to the hospital. What's the problem? Well, typically, a hospital would destroy all clothing and personal belongings of patients who had infectious diseases in order to prevent the spread of the disease. And therefore, if the patient brought his tefillin would be destroyed after he was discharged. Although the person doesn't directly destroy the tefillin, this is nevertheless considered direct destruction because the result is guaranteed to occur. The staff of the hospital in the Dovev Mesharim's days would definitively destroy the tefillin. As a result, the Dovev Mesharim felt this was the same as putting water around the garment that was on fire, in which case it wasn't grama, but it was considered as direct extinguishing. Rav Weiss disagrees, and he dismisses the psak of the Dovev Mesharim, noting a clear distinction between the two cases. In the case of the garment, where you put the water around it, dampening the edges so that the fire would be extinguished, that happens through laws of nature. It's definitely going to happen. However, with the case of tefillin in the hospital, the tefillin's destruction was done by hospital staff, not as a direct natural result. And therefore, according to Rav Weiss, even in those scenarios where there was a risk that tefillin could be destroyed, it was still considered a case of grama. And it was much more like a person going into the mikveh with God's name on their body. Sometimes it might erase God's name. Sometimes the tefillin might be confiscated, but not always. And therefore it wasn't prohibited.